We're very fortunate indeed that General Keith Kellogg has joined us. He is United States Special Envoy for Ukraine. He served in government prior to that. He was National Security Advisor to Vice President Mike Pence in the first Trump administration, as well as Executive Secretary and Chief of Staff of the National Security Council. He is a veteran. He served in Vietnam, where he was decorated with the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and the Air Medal. He also served in the 1990-91 Gulf War in the 82nd Airborne, which he took command of in 1996. And he served also in Iraq after 2003 on the Coalition Provisional Authority. Over the last 4 years, he was chairman of the Center for a New American Security at the America First Policy Institute. And I can't emphasize enough how important that think tank has been in shaping the strategy of the second Trump administration. I think it's extremely important that you're here in person, General. I want to start asking you a question. As a military man, how do you assess the situation of the war at the moment? Do you agree with those who say that Russia is grinding out an inexorable victory because it simply has greater resources and manpower?
Thanks, great question. Victor, thanks for having us here today, I appreciate it as well. If Putin thinks Russia is winning, his definition of winning and my definition of winning are absolutely two different things. If he was winning, he'd be in Kyiv. If he was winning, he'd be west of the Dnieper River. If he was winning, he'd be on Odessa. If he was winning, he would have changed the government. Russia is, in fact, losing this war. Now, they may make movements and say, so, well, they're advancing in the Donbass region and Donetsk, but if you consider advancing moving by meters, not miles, well, then, okay, that's successful. But at the cost they're having, it's enormous. And I don't think people truly appreciate it. It's a number. But the numbers they have lost, when you're talking dead and wounded, well over 1 million, they left Afghanistan after losing 18,000. We left Vietnam after losing 65,000. They've lost over 1 million dead or wounded. These numbers are World War II level numbers when you think about it. They're stunning in the loss. And this is in their first line units that they came and tried to take Kyiv with a little over four years ago. Those first line units are gone. So they've gone through a second or a third or fourth iteration of wartime commanders. They're pulling tanks out of mothballs, out of museums, to put on the battle line. They can't operate in large movements because the Ukrainians will kill them. And the Ukrainians are fighting valiantly on there. And so do I think the Russians are winning? Putin says it, and I think the West just needs to push back and say, no, you're not. And I actually, it's a great question because I was actually asked this question by the President Trump, in the Oval Office, probably 6 weeks ago. Same question, and I responded quite forcefully. And I finally said, Mr. President, don't just listen to me. Your chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Dan Kane, is outside. He's out in the outer oval. Bring him in. Ask him that question. He's your principal military advisor. And he did. And Dan said the same thing. Are they winning? Nope, they're not winning. So Putin could say he's winning all he wants. I know what he wants to do. I know he's trying to do it. But right now, that he wants to take all of Donetsk and Kherson and Zaporizhia as well. But it's a slog for him, and it's the Russians. By the way, it's how the Russians fight.
Well, that's the thing I was going to say. I mean, this is not the first war in Russian history that has been astonishingly wasteful of human life, of Russian lives, and yet on he goes, and it almost seems as if he believes that he ultimately can achieve victory, and that is why he's not interested in ceasefires or serious peace negotiations. President Zelensky said recently, Russia can only be forced into peace through strength, and President Trump has that strength. General, the standard argument is that the United States needs to apply much stronger economic pressure on Russia now, of course, with the support of its allies, and yet that doesn't seem to be happening. Do you think we've now reached the point, perhaps with the violation of Polish territory, that we can say Russia's crossed a red line and President Trump can say, okay, now that does it. Now I'm going to make the sanctions hurt, which seems like the most obvious way to bring Putin to the negotiating table. How do you think about that?
Well, I think you're right. Because I look at there's three lines of attack with Russia on getting them to comply or what they want to do. The first is obviously diplomatic, and I think we've closed that door to a degree, meaning closed. The alliance is quite strong, so the diplomatic lane is pretty well shut down. The military lane is another one, and I think the Ukrainians have shown that they can battle to a standstill. They can put a hold on them well. The rest is economic. And I think this is where everybody, it's the questions were asked earlier today, it's really good. You've got to apply an absolute economic pressures, and this means you've got to put some risk into the game, what you want to do. What do I mean by that? Okay, we talked about sovereign Russian assets, the money. Okay, you're going to have to make a hard call. That's really oligarchs' money. Take their money. And when you talk about the oil, shut down their revenue. It's a petro state. What do you mean by that? With sanctions, we've sanctioned we've sanctioned the shadow fleet. They go through the Baltic Sea. Okay, maybe what you want to do is shut that fleet down to some degree. So apply constant economic pressures. Even maybe going after the National Bank, whatever it is. But that area has been. It's also the same, and I'd say the same thing to the Europeans is, you cannot buy their oil. Stop. And you just have to look at it economically. So I think we're kind of there. Scott Bessent, who's our Secretary of the Treasury, when I talked to him recently, he said if you look at sanctions, because we're talking economics, and you graded them 1 to 10, 1 being low, 10 being high, we're probably at a 6, but enforcement's at a 3. So you've got to enforce the sanctions. Now, what that does, though, that raises your risk level. You've got everybody has got to be willing to go and raise the risk level. Example, the Estonia, when they took a ship in the shadow fleet off the waters in the Baltic Sea and to send it back to St. Petersburg, that's got to be done. You can if you bottle up the Baltic Sea, you shut down 70% of their traffic. You willing to do it? Okay, now the risk level is going up. And that's where you have to ask yourself, is that what you're willing to do?
You and Secretary Bessent were in Alaska at the summit between President Trump and President Putin. Was anything achieved there at all?
Yeah, I think here's what was achieved is, because I think President Trump's got this one right. Under the Biden administration, Biden didn't even talk to Putin. President Trump's a big believer in personal diplomacy, and he actually sat him down and he talked to him, and getting the sides to sit and talk. Even if you hate each other's guts, it means a lot to do that. And to get him on the ground, physically talking about it, at least you kind of open up the door, and kind of people kind of say, well, maybe there's a way out of this. How do we get there? I mean, you may not like doing it, you may not get much out of it, but initially, but at least you've cracked a door open that hasn't been cracked before. So I'm a big believer in if you establish that and establish a level of discourse, you've at least done something that you hadn't done in the previous 4 years.
Is it true to say that President Trump is losing patience with President Putin? And should we feel that there really is going to be an increased economic pressure? You're in touch with the president and with other people in the administration, including Secretary Rubio. Do you sense that we're moving closer to a meaningful change, a real tightening of the sanctions, or is this media speculation and nothing's really changed?
No, I take President Trump at his word, and President Trump has made the comments that he's getting, I'd say my word is exasperated with the movement. And I think one thing I would advise, if I was advising anybody with working with President Trump, do not put him in a position that he thinks he's being used. That is probably the worst place you can be in with him. And I think what she's seeing now is somebody who's being kind of playing a game with him. And I said the comment earlier, and I really do believe this, is I think, and it's an American phrase, so it's not a negative phrase, it's an American phrase. It could be negative if you want to take it. But I said the Ukrainians are in the box. And what I mean by that, they're really good. We've been able to work with President Zelensky, with Andrei and Umarov and the rest of them, and we kept them in a pretty good cardinal direction there. So I'm really comfortable working with them and where they're at and trying to get to an end state, and really good. It's the other lane that's the hard lane.
In many ways, with U.S. aid, military and financial, diminishing in relative terms, this is now Europe's war. At least that's one way of thinking about it. Do you have confidence that the Europeans can step up their rearmament at a sufficiently rapid pace to fill the gap that inevitably is opening up as U.S. military aid is tapered off?
Yeah, I do, because the Russian military has been diminished. The Ukrainians have done a great job on that one. And this is not the Russia, Soviet Union, that I knew in the middle of the Cold War when we had 350, 400,000 U.S. troops in Germany and elsewhere out, and we had to defend the Fulda Gap. It's not your mother's Russia. It's a different Russia. This is Russia. They talk a big game, but I don't think they're and I think right now, the way the Europeans are standing up, I would be very, very worried if I was a Putin. You know, just a comment. He sometimes rattles his nuclear trigger chain by saying, "Well, we're a nuclear power." I'd remind him, the U.S. is too, but so's Britain, so's France, and I said, just throw it right back at him, and I think you're seeing that with the Europeans standing up right now. It's the Europeans' war because it's the Europeans' backyard and they see it, but it's one of those where we had a discussion recently in the Oval where, and it goes back to what I said earlier about, I'm sorry to the ladies in here, right? But they were talking about the primacy of the Russian military and how they were, pretty good. And I said to the people in the room, we'd kick their ass, and I mean by that is, like, don't take their statements at face value. They're not as good as Putin says they are, and that I give great credit to the Ukrainian military because they've taken them down a couple of notches, and so I don't think anybody should be afraid of the Russian military. It's a nuclear power. Check that block. I got that, but they don't have. I don't believe they've got the capacity that they had that they could march towards Berlin or anywhere else.
It seems to me one of President Trump's achievements this year, for which he doesn't get enough credit, is that he's fundamentally altered European attitudes to defense spending, and to the share of the burden that Europe has to bear. This is an amazing achievement because presidents since Richard Nixon have been trying to do it, and President Trump has succeeded. But on the other side, standing behind Russia is China. What is your assessment of the Chinese contribution to the Russian war effort?
I think when you look at the partners, if you look at China and Russia together, Russia is the junior partner. They're not the Chinese. The Chinese have got the economic strength, they've got the military strength, they've got the history clearly behind them, and the leadership behind them as well. And I think that if China cut off support for Russia today, the war would be over tomorrow. I think they cannot survive without Russia's support. And by the way, you got to add in the junior partner in the Far East as well, which is North Korea. If Russia was doing so well, they would not have the need to bring in 10,000 North Korean troops to fight in Kursk, in Sumy, and places like that. They just wouldn't. That shows you the Russian military has got a manpower and a fighting problem as well.
When you try to understand U.S. foreign policy from the outside, it sometimes seems that there are two or three foreign policies competing with one another. One I'll call the global foreign policy, which sees an axis of authoritarians. You mentioned it already, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea working together. But then there's another foreign policy which focuses on China and regards Ukraine and indeed the Middle East as a distraction. And maybe a third one which is focused on just the Western Hemisphere. And I can't tell which of these three has the upper hand. For Ukraine's sake, it needs to be number one. I have the impression that Secretary Rubio has that global conception. Where does the president stand? I would put it this way if I were talking to him now. If Russia wins in Ukraine, that's a win for China. It's also a win for Iran. It's a win for North Korea. We can't possibly want that outcome. Is that an argument that gets traction with the president?
When you talk about different, you were very conservative with three. I can probably give you five at a given day. Where we're at. To start with, Ukraine's not going to lose this war. They're not. I mean, and where I come from, and I'm not talking just in a kinetic sense, like a military sense. I mean, when you go out there, or you go to, and I recently went to the European Military Hospital and places like that, and I've said this to people inside the White House and others, is there's Napoleon Bonaparte once said, morale to physical is 3 is to 1. What he meant by that was the heart of a nation counts 3 times as much as its military. You can't take that away from the Ukrainians. They've got it right here. And so I've got great confidence in them as a nation, where they're going. And President, and the United States has got global responsibilities, and every time you turn around, something else is happening, be it the Middle East, or be it the American, South America, be it Venezuela or anywhere else, and in the Far East as well. And you're trying to balance all of these to the best degree you have, because you've only got so many resources. And when it comes back to American First, where that stood at was, the balance on that was, when I always go back to say, what does it mean? It goes back to our Constitution with the 3 words in our Constitution, big, bold letters, said, we the people. We look at the American people, benefiting the American people. How does it benefit the American people? And primarily where we come from, it's an economic issue. It's not a military issue, it's diplomatic, but it's the economics. And you see a lot of President Trump being very transactional, looking at the economic piece.
Do you think it's got harder to persuade the American people, that they have a stake in the outcome of this war? That's often how it's portrayed in the media. I don't see it in the opinion polls, though, when I look at those. There seems to be a substantially resilient American public support for Ukraine. What's your perception of that? Because it seems hugely important in just assessing what the U.S. does from now on.
Well, I'm glad you said my perception, because it is mine.
Yeah.
And I don't speak for the president, and it's only my view is. But I think people have to recognize, and hopefully they do, that there's a moral aspect to this war as well. There is good, and there is bad. There's right, and there is wrong. And you cannot disassociate that part of a war or an aggressor state or anything else from that. You have to consider that, because this is where I think nations get in trouble. It's if you just look at it from a transactional basis, you have to look at it, what does it look like long term? I've fought multiple wars in the United States. The West has fought 2 world wars because it forgot about the moral imperative, especially in World War II. And I prefer not to go to a World War III, because we forgot the moral imperative of war as well. And so there's good people and there's bad people. There's good things and there's bad things. And I think the American people, when you look at it, fundamentally believe in good, and they know the difference between good and evil, and they see it. I mean, it's and God bless her with like Melania Trump. We call her the Gray Counselor. And a Gray Counselor is somebody who does a lot of counseling in private. It has enormous impact. Is when it was reported in the press when President Trump came into one night with the First Lady and said, well, Melania, I just talked to Vladimir today and things are going good. And her response was, yeah, and he just bombed another city.
Yeah.
Said, okay, she's got it. And I think she kind of gives a guiding light to a moral imperative. And I admire the heck out of her in her views as well.
I want to come back to the military aspect of this, because you're very well positioned to answer this question. It seems to me that the war has a shape-shifting quality. It was a war of armor and initially, a war of infantry for a period, a war of artillery for a period, and now it's a war of drones. I spoke recently to a British war correspondent who'd just come back from the front line, and he described to me a war that's radically different now, even from a year ago. And in that war, drones and the constantly changing frontier of drone technology is now the key, and more important in many ways than raw manpower. Ukraine seems now to be a world leader in defense technology. It's in itself a pretty good argument for making them members of the European Union. But give us your assessment of what has been achieved by Ukrainian defense technology. How does it compare, for example, with what is the state of the art in the United States?
Yeah, well, we're well behind. I mean, the Ukrainians are the leaders of the world in drone technology, and I think it's important. You know, there's a great military strategist since past, Clausewitz, said every age has its own military innovation and use. You know, go back to the battleship, you go back to the aircraft carrier, fighter jets, the tank, whatever it is. It's drones now. And drone technology has changed dramatically what it can mean. I mean, the reason why armored vehicles didn't have armor on the top of the vehicles was because nobody ever shot the top of the vehicle. That's why we developed the Javelin system. The Javelin was a top attack system. We provided it to the Ukrainians early on. It worked very well. That's what the drones do. So the drones have changed that, and we are working with the Ukrainians now to make sure we have got this drone technology exchange, which I think is very, very important. And I think this technology has changed. I mean, for example, I'll just pick it up out of Europe, pick it up out of here. Drone technology, for example, with China and Taiwan, I can't imagine the Chinese trying to take Taiwan in the age of drone warfare, because with the drone waterborne vehicles and everything else, it just has negated a lot of technology. So now that what's happened, you've gone from drones dropping weapons to now counter-drone technology, and you're going to see it change. And I've had the advantage of going to everything from a command center to seeing where the drones are being made and looking at it. And it's absolutely fascinating. It's almost, you hate to say it, it's like a video game out there. When they get behind the screens, it's absolutely antiseptic when you look about it. You know, well, they just took out a tank. Okay, go get a Coke, come back and take out another one. So I think it's dramatically changed warfare, both in cost analysis and how wars are being fought. I think we in the United States are behind. That's the reason we realize that. I think a lot of nations are behind, and I think to the credit of the Ukrainians, they picked up on that, and they're the world leaders in it.
We are fast running out of time. I have time for one last question, and it's a simple one. It takes you back right to your early years. Do you ever wake up in a cold sweat, fearing that Ukraine could end up sharing the fate of South Vietnam? That is to say, we could negotiate a peace, and it could seem to be a breakthrough, but in the end, Ukraine doesn't survive as an independent state in the same way that South Vietnam did not. Is that the nightmare?
Yeah, no, I don't have that nightmare at all, because Ukraine will survive. And the reason for that is because you look at the resiliency of the people. Look, I'll give you an example, and I actually put it on my phone, and it gives you, and I tell people, this kind of gives you an attitude of what this looks like going into the future. And there was a recent, it was put on TikTok or something, that the attacks had gone on. They were people, Ukrainian citizens were in the subway, and sitting in the subway, and they weren't huddled down, eating or drinking. You know what they were doing? They were singing their national anthem. You cannot replicate that. You can't. And that's the fighting heart of a country. That's not going to happen to Ukraine.
General, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, General Keith Kellogg.